It's time once again for another episode of Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, broadcasting live from the Pro Business Channel studios in Atlanta. And now, here's your host, Emily-Rowell.
Good morning and welcome to another Atlanta Legal Experts Radio show. I am your host, Emily-Rowell, and I have Clay Westbrook here. He is with Ascent Consultants, and he wrote the book, Debt and Circuses, Protecting Business Owners from Their Enemies, Their Allies, and Themselves. Good morning, Clay.
Good morning, Emily.
Thank you so much for being here this morning.
I'm very glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your book.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but I did practice law for 15 years, and I've been doing consulting for the past 8 years, primarily workouts and restructuring for troubled companies. I work with lawyers on almost all of the cases, and we get into litigation about half the time and bankruptcy about 20% of the time. So it's all over the place. You never know from one case to the next what's going to happen.
And how does the book actually benefit practicing attorneys?
Well, over the course of time, a lot of us talked about we should write a book about everything that we've seen and done, but nobody, it seemed, got around to doing that. But over the course of the years, I've seen a lot of simple mistakes made that cost people a lot of money. I've seen lawyers give a lot of bad advice based upon incorrect assumptions. And I've seen borrowers, business owners suffer tremendously when they didn't really need to if they were getting the right advice at the right time.
And as a consultant, how can you help attorneys better serve their clients?
Well, attorneys face a couple of challenges, particularly in these types of cases where you really sort of need to think out of the box and think more from a financial perspective than in addition to a legal perspective. And that's a lot of what I can give. And we'll just play it straight. I can give the business owners some advice that lots of lawyers can't give them due to their restraints and concerns of professional liability and things like that. That
makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was Clay Westbrook on Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, the author of Debt and Circuses. And I appreciate you being on the show. This is Emily Rowell, your host, Atlanta Legal Experts Radio. Thank you, Clay, again for being here this morning. We do have Clay Westbrook in the room here with us in the studio, and he wrote the book, Debt and Circuses, Protecting Business Owners from Their Enemies, Their Allies, and Themselves. A little bit about Clay. He is an attorney and consultant who spent 7 years involved with over 100 loan workout cases, dozens of lawsuits and business bankruptcies, and hundreds of millions of bad debts. He advises clients on business breakups, litigation and bankruptcy strategy, and negotiating with taxing authorities and governmental entities. Now, tell me a little bit. You were in law for 15 years, and you decided no more.
Well, sort of. I didn't decide to stop practicing law. I was a commercial real estate lawyer in 2008 working at the Dwayne Morris law firm. And as you may know, in 2008, all commercial real estate work dried up.
Yes.
And so the economy sort of made the decision for me, but it was something that I always felt I should probably do, is to move over to the consulting and the financial side as opposed to the legal side.
So it's a little boost.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people went through a ton of change, of course, and a lot of it, though, to me, was a stepping stone to something different that needed to happen in their life. So I've heard that before. So you're taking your legal expertise and also with all the cases that you worked on previously to help business owners and attorneys also that have business owners as clients. And who else do you help?
Who else do I help? Ask again. Sorry.
Sure. That's okay. So you help business owners and attorneys that have clients that are business owners. What types of clients do these attorneys have? Business owners that are facing bankruptcy, that are in bad deals. Tell me a little bit about who they serve.
Well, it's really not industry specific.
Okay.
In the early days of the recession, it was almost entirely real estate developers.
Okay.
As time has gone on, it's become a good mix of real estate owners and operating company owners as well. Typically, my clients will have between $1 million and $10 million in outstanding debts, and either the inability to pay them or they see a maturity of a loan coming down the road, and they know that because of the condition of their business, they're not going to be able to take out that loan without some sort of help from their current lender.
Gotcha. And so you basically help them through the intricacies of getting a loan and saving their business in most cases.
Yes, in most cases, it's as simple as painting the accurate financial picture for their own lenders.
Gotcha.
It is surprising how often we see that a business owner not only doesn't understand their own finances, but can't even speak intelligently to their financial advisors about the situation that they're in. In other words, they don't understand the danger that they're in many instances.
A lot of times, do they use their small cash flow to cover up things, or just kind of they're in denial in a way?
Almost always, denial is a problem.
Yeah.
And a lot of decisions are made based not so much on the big picture, but for the sake of keeping up appearances or just cutting expenses that don't need to be cut. And then on the other side, getting advice from their legal counsel, telling them that they basically have no choice but to do whatever their creditors demand they do.
Right. And so when you sit down with these people originally, is it hard to get them to start telling, admitting or even seeing what the real truth is about their situation?
The difficulty is usually in identifying the prospective clients from the very beginning because, as you know, people don't talk to strangers about their financial problems, and
Sure.
they don't talk to many of their friends about their financial problems. And that's how things can get out of hand as well.
Sure.
And so too many of the people that come to us after it's too late, and it's really more about advising them on the safest way to get into a personal bankruptcy or avoid a personal bankruptcy, but in reality end up liquidating their assets and starting over. I spoke with a gentleman just yesterday who had to file for personal bankruptcy in 2009 and is trying to help out some business partners who are still on the hook for a loan, a real estate loan in the Florida Panhandle that went bad 6 years ago that they're still fighting.
Jeez. Yeah, so it's always too late because they always want to talk about their problems after it happens.
That's right.
So tell me a little bit about how you can help lawyers help their clients in financial disputes and business litigation.
Most of it is experience, really. In virtually every situation, I can look at the totality of the circumstances and pretty much be able to explain exactly what's going to happen depending on which path they decide to take. Mm-hmm. The lawyers can read and understand the documents and understand the strength or lack of strength of the legal case. But in so many of these cases, the legal case doesn't even matter or is a very small front in a much larger war because the likelihood of collecting on a judgment is an entirely different matter from the likelihood of obtaining one.
Oh, that's huge. Yeah. And so you can actually express different ways or show them different ways that doesn't have to do with the legal side of it, that the lawyer's not always going to see. And so you kind of work hand in hand with these lawyers.
That's the way it works when we get into a litigation situation particularly, because lots of times we're looking at a piece of litigation that is bound to eventually end up where we are on the losing side. But in the meantime, there can be lots of things going on apart from the litigation where we can be negotiating with the creditors and more often simply communicating the accurate financial picture to the creditors to try to reach a settlement that isn't just each side picking a number and then eventually ending up somewhere in the middle, because we can do that in almost every case, but just because we can get a creditor to take less than they are owed doesn't mean that our client has the money to pay that amount. Right.
Will you tell me about one of your cases that you talked about, or circumstances that you talked about in the beginning of the book, where the client was facing a bunch of debt, and he actually, or had a bunch of debt, and he needed a loan, and you actually worked with him and the creditor, and it so happened that the new buyer came in to buy as part of his business. Can you tell us a little bit about that without naming names, of course?
That was I was around 2010, and the story is of an owner of a retail business with multiple locations, and his loan matured, and the business had fallen on very hard times in the recession, and he was unable to pay off the loan any more than 30 or 40 cents on the dollar, probably. We were eventually able to persuade upon his bank that that's all he could do. He did not have the ability to get another bank loan, but along the way, a buyer came along who wanted to buy some of his locations for more than the amount that the bank was willing to take. So he was in a position where if his bank found out that he had a buyer who would pay more than they would take, then they would want all of the money.
Right.
Whereas if the buyer found out that the bank was willing to take less, then they would offer less. So the closing of the purchase and the payoff of the loan was scheduled for the same day, but he needed to borrow several $1 million to pay off the loan from a third party for about 6 hours. And so we were able to locate an investor willing to put up the money. Basically, if the first deal didn't close, he would fund the payoff of the loan.
Wow. Yeah. That was like, talk about the skin of your teeth.
It was crucial in the entire transaction, or it was actually 3 transactions,
right,
that two of the two sides, the bank and the buyer, never knew of the other's existence or their transaction.
So there was probably like a 24-hour period right there that you guys were all sweating bullets.
It was about a week or two, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because those deals it takes a lot of time to put those together.
Sure.
So I wish I could say the name of the investor's lawyer who sort of made the whole thing go, because she did a fantastic job. But that was one instance where a talented lawyer came in and understood the big picture and got the deal done, no questions asked. Right.
That's amazing. That's awesome. And you really saved that client. And he paid out a lot on the loan, but in the bottom line is that he was able to save a lot of his business, correct?
That's correct. And let's be clear, it wasn't just me. There were a lot of people a lot of people involved, and that was, in that case, my role was primarily putting together everything to paint the accurate financial picture for all sides that were involved, but the investor and the lender.
There's other cases you mentioned, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that you run into that have had really hard times especially through 2008, the recession during that time period. Can you tell me, are there any other cases that you've worked on before and actually saved them from going into financial strain, and maybe another favorite case of yours that you could talk about?
Well, if a client can find us in time, we can work out something with their existing creditors to restructure their debts about half the time.
Right.
About half the time, we're able to paint the picture, paper up a deal to modify, extend, or maybe a discounted payoff of the loan if the client can source some financing. Mm-hmm. But in about half of the cases, the creditors, one or more of the creditors, is recalcitrant and does not believe us, or the relationship has personally soured to the point between the bank and the borrower where both sides are just ready to tangle. Mm-hmm. So we get into litigation about half the time.
Okay.
And with each case, we always take a look at the company and its finances to try to decide whether a Chapter 11 reorganization is feasible. Mm-hmm. Is there cash flow available to service the debt, and all of the other factors that go into trying to get a bankruptcy plan approved. That works about 1 time in 5, I found from looking back over the years. About 20% of the time, that's a viable option.
Sure.
We don't always have to follow through with the bankruptcy, and we only had 1 or 2 out of a couple of dozen cases where we weren't able to settle the case before getting the plan approved and going through the entire bankruptcy process.
Oh, that's nice.
There comes a time where the creditors realize that we're not lying and we're never going to give up.
Right. And, sometimes bankruptcy, I've had bankruptcy attorneys on the show in the past, and, it's a restart, so sometimes it's not such a bad thing, just depending on each case.
A bankruptcy lawyer that I work with put it best when he said that doing a Chapter 11 reorganization takes the power in the situation away from the creditors and puts it back in the debtor's borrower's hands.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Rich Casanova here, producer, engineer. I want to remind our listeners you're listening to Atlanta Legal Experts Radio, and we're having a conversation with Clay Westbrook of Ascent Transaction Restructuring and Legal Consulting. You're a former attorney and now currently a business consultant. And so speaking of Chapter 11, let's turn our attention to Chapter 2 and 4 in your book.
That was good.
All right. And so talk to us about the debtor-creditor cases and business divorce. Is that different than other litigation?
It is, in the sense that when 2 parties are trying to put together a deal, if they cannot reach an agreement ultimately, then one side or both sides can simply walk away. But in these cases, neither side can walk away because they're already entangled in a business relationship gone bad. The situation does not differ really between a debtor-creditor dispute or a dispute between business partners or a dispute with a governmental entity. You're already in the kettle together, and neither of you can get out without cooperation.
Right. So tell me a little bit about basically if there's anything new on the horizon for your business, anything coming up that you would like to announce, or any changes, or you're just still trucking along?
Well, I am trucking along.
That's a Southern thing, by the way.
So I got, when I was getting the production done for the book, mm-hmm. and when I finished writing the book and getting the book edited, I was relieved that I had finally gotten the job done, and not realizing that I was barely halfway done with getting the book actually in people's hands,
right?
The production side. So I got most of the way through the production side of the thing and said, if I'm going to this much trouble to get this book done, I'm going to write another one for sure. So
Great.
I'm working on a second book that I'm going to put out later this year, hopefully.
Do you have a title for it yet?
That's classified right now,
okay.
But it's not the same. It approaches this. It approaches these types of situations more from the standpoint of people living beyond their means and how people get themselves into trouble. It goes into a lot more detail about the psychology and the thinking of people with financial problems and how to break that cycle.
We'll have to have you back on for sure to announce that book.
Please do.
And if you'll let all of our listeners know how they can reach you.
Sure. My website is ascentstrategygroup.com. If you want to send me an email, you can email me at cwestbrook@ascentstrategygroup.com, or you can call my office at 678-466-0077. My office is in Buckhead.
And that's ASCENT.
That's correct. Ascent.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show. We have Clay Westbrook. Say that 5 times fast. On Atlanta Legal Experts Radio. I am your host, Emily Rowell, and we look forward to next week.
Thank you again for joining Emily Rowell and her guests on the Pro Business Channel. Use the social media links here to share today's show And stay tuned for the next episode of Atlanta Legal Experts Radio.
We are live once again at LeaderCast 2016.